So my question's pretty broad, and it's for all of you. So my question is, do you think the root cause of end-of-life issues is an improper understanding of human suffering? And if so, how can this be corrected on a nationwide level? So what are your thoughts on solutions for this, practically speaking?
There we go. We got it. So the question was, if I heard it correctly, because we had a little difficulty hearing it up here, what was the first part of the question again? That was.
So if you think what the root cause of these end-of-life issues are, if it's do you think it's improper understanding of human suffering? And how do you correct that if that is the problem?
I think, and maybe I'd like to hear other people's perspectives on it. I think the suffering is one of the main. It's one of the things, and I'd like to come back to it. But I think the biggest problem is we have the secular culture, and we have culture of faith. The secular culture today. It's interesting because there's two ways to look at it. They will do a secular view of the world, will do everything to maintain life, but at the same time, when there's nothing that can be done, we end life. And here's what I'm trying to say here. There's a very interesting article a couple of years ago out of the New Yorker magazine, which is certainly not a Catholic publication at all. But it was talking about assisted suicide. And the author made what I thought was a very profound point. And she said this, she said, assisted suicide is the atheist's solution to the atheist's dilemma. I'll say that again. It's the atheist's solution to the atheist's dilemma. So for someone who doesn't believe in God, who just believes in utter autonomy, you do whatever the heck you want to do, well, that's going to be the big difference is, you do whatever you want to do. That's really what underlies all this. But for a person who has that belief, suffering is, they don't know what to do with it. They don't understand it. There's obviously no purpose to it, which we would say, well, there is, there can be a purpose to it. There is a purpose to it. But they see no purpose to it at all. So it's a dilemma for them. What do? We don't see any reason for this, and there's no way that we can alleviate it, or so they think. And so what happens? Well, kill yourself, right? Assisted suicide. So from our perspective, it's a false dilemma, but it's a dilemma that's caused by one's atheism. And so what's the only thing you do? Well, you kill the person. So I think in the end, what's the root cause is the fact that we live in a culture that has essentially rejected God, has rejected any understanding of objective morality, and what we call freedom, or what our society calls freedom, is really license, the ability to do whatever the heck you want to do whenever you want to do it. And I think that's really, that underscores, that's the beginning of life debates, it's the end of life debates, it's really everything, is who determines what's right and wrong? Is it us? Or is it God? And I think that's really what's at the heart of it all.
I'll just make a quick comment. I think the root cause is embedded in each of us, in every single human being. The essence of our lives is to live, to continue to live. We all have that. For all the patients that I've ever dealt with working in death and dying, as much as someone doesn't want to suffer, and as much as someone may say to you, I want to die, every cell within them, every aspect of their being seeks to live. And I think the conflict is back to our original purpose, right? How were we created? We were created in the image and likeness of God. We were created to live forever. And yet, because of Adam and Eve, because of original sin, because of the problems that we've experienced through generations, we have that conflict within us. So unless we can continue to evangelize society and help the younger people learn and understand, even if it's not within the Catholic framework, within a philosophical framework of helping them understand what it is that life really is, only then can we help them deal with the suffering and understanding the suffering that comes with end of life, in my opinion.
I'll say it.
Right, no, that's really insightful. I agree with both. I think there's another aspect to it, which we see in practice, which is really the opposite of the individual who do whatever you want. Because as healthcare becomes more and more financed by the state, and there becomes a little bit the tail wagging the dog or the cart before the horse. Normally, if we make advances and that therefore healthcare is becoming more expensive, then you have to raise the insurance premiums, et cetera, et cetera. But when the state is in charge or is in control how much is paid and it pays for everything, they say, well, this is our budget and we can't go beyond it because we'd have to raise taxes and then we won't get elected again if we raise taxes. So therefore, rationing always becomes an issue. So now the cost of keeping somebody alive who legitimately needs to be kept alive, well, if we can somehow manipulate the system that they will choose death, then it'll be less expensive. So it's always less expensive to kill somebody than to cure somebody. So that's becoming it's a political and a societal problem in that regard. But I have a couple other things to say, but let's go on. Why don't you say what you were going to say?
Sure. I was going to comment, but you go first.
No, because this question piggybacks off that.
Okay, yeah. This may sound like a glib lawyer answer to the question. I agree with the perspectives of all the panelists here. It goes deeper than that. It's the mystery of evil. The mystery of evil. That's the root cause. These are all factors, but there's an underlying consideration which we'll never know. We just don't know why Eve said, yeah, let's eat the apple, okay? We know it's pride. I think Eileen touched upon that. But there's a confluence of all these factors, and I don't know that you can ever explain them away simply by saying there's a root cause, okay? I think that's a large part of it. This society, this secular society, does not appreciate that suffering has any value, but I think it's more than that. I think it's all the factors that go into contributing to that culture, and I can only answer that by saying it's part of the mystery of evil.
Well, now that he mentions we need a lighter side of this because it's really heavy. Now that Gerry mentions evil, I have to give you a lawyer joke. Uh-oh. No, I'm not saying all lawyers are evil. No, I'm not saying that. But there's the traditional shipwreck, and there's a doctor, a priest, and a lawyer are in a lifeboat, but they lost the oars, so they're floating around in the sea with no direction, nowhere to go. And, a couple of days pass, they're starting to get dehydrated, the sun's hot every day. So they finally decide that if we're going to survive, one of us is going to have to swim to shore and get help. So the priest immediately says, well, it can't be me, because if the other person dies or is dying, I have to give them their last rites. So the doctor says, well, it can't be me, because the other person gets sick or dying, I'm going to have to tend to them. So the lawyer says, I don't see any function for me out here. I think I'm the one who has to do it. So he goes ahead and jumps in the water, and he's swimming, and the priest is praying, Lord, please protect him, etc. Lo and behold, on the left, there's a whole row of fins approaching the lawyer. And on the right, there's another row of fins. And the doctor says, oh my God, what's happening here? So they keep praying, Lord, please save him. Whatever. And instead of being attacked, all those fins, all those sharks form a corridor to show them the way to shore. And the priest says, thank you, Lord, it's a miracle. And the doctor says, no, it's just professional courtesy.
I wish I knew some bad doctor jokes, George. He's my buddy here, putting me down. No, I'll give you a good lawyer joke. How do you know when it's really cold outside? Your lawyer has his hands in his own pockets.
I have a question here that was raised by Laura, who's not here at the moment, but wanted to ask a question. And Joe, maybe you can answer this, and I think it piggybacks, again, a little bit on your question. She said, this forum was 95% attended by middle-aged and older. How does this message of correct Christian realist ethics on end-of-life issues get to or reach the under 40 crowd or the under 20 crowd? You want to answer that?
Well, if anyone's interested, we're here with Generation Life, and we came to help develop our part of end-of-life curriculum by listening to you today. So, we go into grade schools, high schools, and colleges, and we educate them on pro-life and chastity. And I really want us to build up our end-of-life curriculum for our pro-life, because I think the abortion aspect is huge, but I think this is under discussed. So thank you very much for everything you guys are doing. And you can all talk to me if you want.
Yeah, I think you two are that table is, you're definitely the standard deviation below the mean age here. In answer to the question, I think it's interesting because before coming to the NCBC, I was a college professor and would teach healthcare ethics classes to nurses, traditional college-age students who were in nursing programs. And they were actually very interested in end-of-life issues, but you had to kind of get them to it. And they were sort of I don't want to say an easy mark, because these are the people they're going to be dealing with. This is going to be their patients. I would say, here's just I think on one side, it's very difficult to get people interested, younger people interested in end-of-life issues, because it's not a reality for them, or they don't perceive that it's a reality for them. So that's part of it. But I think there's certain hooks that you can do. So for example, you're going to likely be a healthcare power of attorney for your parents. What are you going to do when those questions come up? Because we get those people all the time. I think something else to do too, and I mentioned this earlier, is I've always found it's always good to give people incentives to want to get them in the door, so to speak. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do. I mentioned this, this is just another shameless plug for our education programs, but we are putting together an undergraduate level bioethics course that we're going to, it's essentially like an AP course for high schools that we're going to offer to high schools. And we've got like Lancaster Catholic High School is very, very interested, and some others are as well. It's one of those, dangle the carrot in front of people to say, hey, you can, for X amount of money, you can get 3 college credits, which is actually a lot of money, and then kind of get them in that door, and then, expose them to these issues. I found that once young people you present it to them in a way that, oh, crap, this actually really does have relevance to my life, they pay attention, and they get it. We talked. We have to talk some more about how we could work together on this. Absolutely.
There's a question back.
I'm troubled by what you were saying about organ donation. It seems to me that the criteria that could you do this? Sure. I just want to say I'm troubled by what you were saying about organ donation, because it seems to me if we go with what Pope John Paul II said about not knowing exactly when life ends, having your life end by having your organs taken out seems to be about as far from a happy death as I can personally imagine. Articles I've read recently do seem to indicate that is what's happening. I used to be an organ donor, and I took it off my license and everything about 5 years ago. Can you comment on that?
Well, I have to say I agree with you 100%. Now, what Joe mentioned about the strict application of the criteria, well, in my opinion, not only is that not being done because it's driven by the organ donation industry, who's want as fresh organs as possible,
Exactly.
obviously, but also the criteria are inadequate, and I'm glad to see that they're being re-examined. For instance, the function of the hypothalamus, there's nothing in those criteria. And the second thing, very simply, I think, more than 50% of all the brain death that's declared are probably not truly dead, except they didn't have the the advantage of being kept alive on life support, like the girl, I can never pronounce her name either, but yeah, because immediately their organs were taken. So, but to my mind, for instance, maintaining a blood pressure involves the medulla, which is a brain function. And you will see that it's not a criterion in most places. So that they're not on an artificially maintained blood pressure, they're still maintaining their own blood pressure, meet the other criteria, and they say, okay, they're brain dead. As far as I'm concerned, it can't possibly be brain dead, So now, some people play it very safe and say that's impossible to know, so therefore we should do away with brain death altogether. I'm not of that opinion. I'm somewhere in between. I mean, it really does exist. But after all death is brain death. Now, when we declare somebody dead at the bedside because their heart stopped and their lungs stopped and they stopped breathing and their pupils are dilated, they're not necessarily brain dead yet. But since this is a patient we know we're not going to resuscitate because we know the course of the illness, and at that point, we're not doing anything wrong, because if they really die 10 minutes later or a half hour later, it doesn't matter. We weren't going to do anything anyhow. And I guess, you're not going to leave them in that hospital bed forever, because it's got to be cleared out so a new patient can come in. I'm a little cynical about that. But I've had experiences where people looked, completely dead and were not going to be resuscitated. And then it showed some life after that, for a short period. So nobody knows how long it takes for that brain to die under normal circumstances. So you can see when we're trying to look for the brain death, when that's an important issue because of organ donation, how difficult that is. But be that as it may, as I say, so if you want to put down on, I don't want to be an organ donor, I think you've got a perfectly right to do that, and that should be respected. Yeah.
No, on the ground, I have clients all the time. If you remember, Joe, that's the only choice that we have on the one I'm using right now, okay? Do you want to be an organ donor or do you not? That's the only, in my current portion of the living will, bite my tongue again, advanced declaration. And I can tell you honestly, I have the same suspicions that you have, okay? And I do not encourage people to do organ donation just because of the climate of the culture today. I think people are kept artificially alive so it can be done. That's the suspicion, okay? And so the only thing I tell people is if they consent to organ donation and if it's on their license, okay, which it typically is, then you don't want to say you don't consent to it, because that presents a conflict, and we don't know how to resolve that. But if they're indifferent to it and they don't have it on their license, I don't encourage it. And maybe that's a selfish perspective. I don't know, George, but I think it's safe. It's being safe on the side of error. I think that's all.
I do run into that scenario frequently in the hospital with patients, and oftentimes it may be where a sibling or a parent who is a power of attorney, a medical power of attorney by default, or surrogate decision maker, didn't realize that their son or husband or whoever had it on their license. And the person, chose to be an organ donor, just thinking, well, this is a good thing to do, without really realizing the implications. Perhaps yourself, that you thought, oh, I'm going to be an organ donor, not really realizing what it all entailed. So I would encourage people, if they have any inkling or desire or any interest in it, to really research in your state, in your county, in your system, through the legal system and through your healthcare provider, what it really means and what you're really signing up for. As well as to recognize that as the medical power of attorney, at least in my experience, those parents, for example, that I've had parents who've overrode the decision of that child that was made to be an organ donor, so that when the organ donation team comes in and swoops around and circles around, that parents still have been able to override that decision of it being on their license. Some people will say, no, you can't do that. And I've had very strong parents who've said, oh, yes, I can. You're not going to take my son's heart, et cetera. So it's a complex, difficult situation from all perspectives. And so I just encourage you to inform yourselves more and more on the issues as they go on.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say, can I? Yeah. In the previous version that I had, which I showed Joe, I had a clause saying, do you want the healthcare representative to be bound by your decisions, or do you want to just make those decisions guidance and let the healthcare proxy, healthcare representative ultimately make that decision? I think in the latter case, if it's left to the healthcare representative, I think they can do that, Eileen. I think they have that ability. But I think, if the advance declaration, if it were pressed, and if I represented the transplant people, I think I could argue pretty convincingly that, look, this is the decision this person made, and they've instructed the agent that they're bound by my instructions. So, anyway.
I think you'd have the whole hospital system against you. Because that is a big problem, that you will get someone who says, oh, well, even this advance directive is what the patient wanted, and the family wants something very different, and so we've oftentimes run into ethical problems there. But it becomes also a legal situation, because most hospitals these days are always going to err on the side of caution for themselves, so that they are not going to be legally sued and assume risk. So whoever pushes harder sometimes in the long run is the one who may win.
Yeah, just to go back to the question, I just want to respond to the what was stated before, and just a couple of things to respond to that and to keep in mind. So first of all, I have told people in consults, if they have concerns about organ donation, don't be an organ donor. I mean, absolutely, there's no moral obligation for you to do it. Make it take it off your driver's license, and here's something to keep in mind. I ran across this in Ohio. Now this, not for minors, but for, everybody here is over 18. Even the people at our table over here, they're as well. What OPOs, organ procurement organizations, will do is if I have indicated on my driver's license that I'm an organ donor, and my wife says something happens, and my wife says, no, I don't want to be an organ donor, the OPO will say, it's called first person consent. And your husband said he wanted to be an organ donor, and legally we're going to take his organs. And they can do that, and that's what they will say. So, kind of keep that in mind. But again, if you don't want to be an organ donor, make that very clear, take it off your driver's license, and maybe this is actually, I'm going to revise my advice on living wills. Maybe fill only that section of the living will that says, I do not want to be an organ donor. Then it's, that's illegally, so you could do that as well. I do want to mention one thing, and this was part of my game time decision in here to cut this out of my presentation. John Paul II's words about, how not being contrary to a sound Catholic anthropology, there was a part below that I skipped, and it had to do with moral certitude. And what John Paul II also said was that and I'm trying to explain it and apply it at the same time, but when we're making moral decisions, it's very rare that we can ever act with absolute moral certitude. I mean, we don't know everything. But we do have something called, absolute certitude we don't have. There is something called moral certitude, which I have it in the presentation, it's in the notes and everything else. And it's basically what it comes down to in very layman's terms is if you do everything absolutely possible to get all the information that you possibly can, and you make a decision, even if you're wrong, essentially you're not going to be held morally responsible for it. And so what John Paul II was basically saying, and the second part of that quote that we were talking about is, if you go through, like for brain death, if you go through all of the medical criteria, all of the sound, now the criteria has to be sound, it has to be rigorously applied. If you go through all of that criteria and the person essentially fails everything and a diagnosis of brain death is made, then you can say with moral certitude that the person is dead. It's not absolute certitude, but John Paul II uses moral certitude. And so that's kind of where we come from. But again, if anybody here, if you are, if you don't feel that you should be, there's something, if you have any inkling about it at all, don't be an organ donor.
We have a question here in the front as well.
I'm so confused editing the session, and I'm feeling uneasy and anxiety because all the professionals seem to be cynical about organ donation, like the organ team is swooping around. And if the person's declared dead, the next step, where do they go? To the morgue? I don't know. They get embalmed at the funeral home. They get cremated. Their organs are gone now. So I don't understand. Are you thinking that the medical team is declaring people dead when they're not, just to get their organs? Like this is like trafficking? I mean, I don't understand.
In my experience, you can't take vital organs when there's no breathing and no heartbeat. So a person can be declared brain dead and be kept on a ventilator so that then they can take the organs, right? You can give organs, you can give eyes, skin, I think eyes and skin might be the only thing, afterwards, and those are considered organ donations. But to be vital organs, the patient has to literally be kept ventilated and perfused. Those organs have to be perfused. So forgive me if I created a bad image of organ donation with saying the swooping. What I meant also is that determination of brain death can sometimes be questionable. And so therefore, for someone to easily say the person's brain dead, and then they take them to the OR on the ventilator and continuing with everything until they take the organs out, then they disconnect everything. It's not as if you're dead and then they take your organs, right? As if you're not on life support. So it's a complex situation. It's not as easy as, oh, I'm a big organ donor, I died in my bed, and now they're going to come and take my heart and my lungs and give them to someone else, because they have to keep that heart and lungs perfusing. Does that make sense?
I guess I'm thinking, even if you're being kept alive on a ventilator and you don't donate your organs, you're still going to be buried with your organs or cremated, or it just seems, I don't understand. Yeah, it's complex.
I think I might be helpful. I remain cynical because even those protections that you can't be part of the team, the person declaring the brain death is second, it falls apart when you have a big institution and both the team and the physician are employees of that institution, and they're looking at big bucks with all this, payments and all that. So, but beyond the cynicism, I think what might be helpful is you don't have to be on a ventilator until you're declared brain dead. No, I mean, that's only if you're going to donate organs. Normally, you can withdraw people from a ventilator who are perfectly alive, but they're at the end of and the ventilator is extraordinary treatment because either they would have to be on it for the rest of their life or they're going to die. They're dying anyhow, and they're going to die shortly thereafter, even on the ventilator. So it's perfectly okay to withdraw the ventilator, and then people die after that. They're not declared dead until they're really dead. So if you understand that, because some people think, and it influences their living wills. They say, I don't want to be on the ventilator because they think I'm going to have to be on the ventilator forever until I'm brain dead. That's not true at all. So as Joe mentioned, the ordinary, extraordinary applies. I don't know if that's helpful to you or not, okay?
Actually, I want to say, don't take this the wrong way. But the fact that you're experiencing confusion on this is actually a good thing because there's a lot of complexity to it. So if the issue was we had absolute airtight medical criteria for determining whole brain death, and that criteria was 100% of the time rigorously and properly applied, and so we knew with moral certainty that you or whomever was dead, okay, organ donation, not a problem. The problem is that that criteria was set, and what we're seeing as the years go by is a lessening. Let me rephrase it this way: the bar was set way up here, And what we're seeing as time goes by is that bar is going down and down and down and down and down. So it's not the organ donation in and of itself that's problematic. The problem is, what's the criteria that we're using? Are we following the criteria? Or as what's happening today in a number of different, I only mentioned one of them with the UDDA, people are trying to lessen that criteria for determining. So is it confusing? Yes. Yeah, it is confusing. But it's confusing in many ways because of the actions of those who are trying to, for whatever reason, and there's different motivations, are seeking to change the criteria and change the way we do things.
I want to interrupt here because I just want to be cognizant of everyone's time. We have one last question here. And then after that, if people have individual questions, feel free to ask them. And but I'm going to pass it over to Barb. She has a question. And I'm also going to just invite you all, when you leave, to take more food, drinks, or whatever on your way out. And just thank the speakers for all being here. You've been fantastic. And I want to thank Father Fitzpatrick for supporting our Respect Life Committee. And on behalf of the whole Respect Life Committee, thank you for being here. But here's another question. And again, like I said, feel free to hang out and talk to the speakers one-on-one.
Just before that, make sure you check in your folders for the resource sheet of all these different websites you can go to for more information. Besides the Catholic Bioethics Center, who has the consulting service, we have on there listed the Terry Schiavo Life and Hope Network. You can call them also. If you have a hospital who wants to pull plugs and you don't want them to, you can call them. They will give you a doctor who will help you talk to the hospital and tell you how to argue with them. Right, Joe? Okay.
Joe, I will make one comment, self-serving. I do practice law in Chester County, in spite of what my associate has put on our flyer. And if anyone would like to consult me, please feel free to do so. All right? Pardon me? They're out on the... They're out there. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, George.
So it seems to me...
Is there one more question?
Yeah, it seems to me with your discussion, everything, is it probably the safest? Can you just leave the question of organ donation blank so that the medical power of attorney can make the decision at the moment? Because if you put no, does that ultimately mean your organs can never be used?
Yeah. I think I'm the appropriate person to answer that question here, because I deal with that document day in and day out. And if people are uncertain, I tell them to leave it blank. And I think you can make an argument that the person who was identified as the healthcare representative could ultimately do that because the decision was not made. You know, that's why you might, if you don't want it, you might want to keep your healthcare representative from making decisions and making him bound or her bound by what you've indicated.
Thank you. Just one more comment about the brain death. The question as to why people are willing to declare people, even knowing that they're not brain dead, as brain dead, is because of that same cultural problem. These are the same people who would accept euthanasia to get your organs. So the only reason they're using the criteria in a lot of these cases is just to protect themselves legally so they don't get sued. They wouldn't mind if you were definitely alive and still take your organs. That's the problem that we have today. And so you have to be very careful as to who's doing all this decision making. Okay, can I make one more comment, and it'll be the end? Because we talked about the hospice. Now, if every hospice was like, and palliative care was like Eileen is talking about, we wouldn't have a problem. But just keep in mind, there's a structural problem in hospice. Now, she is part of a VITAS system, which is like a franchise system. Now, theirs is good. But in my experience, the VITAS we had in my hospital was the worst ever. One of the problems was that they're a very for-profit organization. Do you know that they were owned, are they still owned by Roto-Rooter? Okay, Roto-Rooter, for-profit company. And you know, when you see services advertised, you know that they're making a lot of money, right? So the way it's set up by Medicare is that it's like a giant HMO with no with very poor controls. So Medicare per patient per day gives the company money. And you do with it what you want. There's some minimum standards, I'm sure. So the less they spend, the more they make, all right, the more they keep. So I was told that, oh, I can't do that for the hospice patient because Medicare doesn't cover it. And it turns out it doesn't matter. They could cover it. They could do it, and a lot of good hospices will do it. They're not going to get paid extra. It's just going to be part of that capitation. So they don't want to do it because it's going to be, they're getting instructions from the administrators, you're spending too much money. So you got to keep that in mind, and that's a big factor. But the other factor is the philosophy of the people involved. They're not all like Eileen. I'll just give you one quick example, and I think this really it goes back to the core of end-of-life issues. And we talk about sedation, terminal sedation. I remember very early in the game I learned this, and there was a patient that had cancer of the pancreas, was metastatic all over. She was clearly very, very close to the end of life, but she had a lot of pain, and we had a morphine drip. So that means morphine just dripping all the time. That's what it took to control her pain. And we've had to pretty much keep her at a level that she wasn't completely unconscious, but she was just, completely drunk with it to control the pain. And that's perfectly good, and that's perfectly ethical. But we had an IV going with the drip, and I went in there. She was on hospice. And I said there was no nutrition given. She couldn't eat at that point, couldn't drink. I said, well, we got the IV going. Let's give her some water. Let's give her some saline, some hydration to keep her from having the additional pain of dehydration. At least we control that with fluids. And the nurse says, no, we can't do that. That's not part of our protocol. I said, why not? And and the answer was, oh, Medicare won't pay for it. And I said, well, that's all right, I'll pay for it. What's a bottle of IV cost? And then they said, no, they still do it. And I kept pressing. And she says, wow, but if we do that, she'll live longer. And think about that. That was the philosophy, that the sooner she dies, the sooner she'll stop suffering. And we go back to that initial question. Again, the structural thing, one last thing, is my uncle, who died at the age of 102 in Austria. He was a retired doctor, very funny guy. He had the terminal dementia. He couldn't eat. Well, according to their system, hospice was like home care. It didn't have all these rules. So he had there was a nurse that came around, I think, twice a week and gave him an infusion of saline with vitamins and some nutrition in it. He was, so far gone that the nutrition didn't make a difference because it would take him a month or so to starve. He didn't have that much life in him, but he was getting hydrated. She'd give him enough hydration that would last him for 3 or 4 days, and pull the IV out, and then come back 3 or 4 days later and give him another infusion of 50, and she would make the rounds like that. And that's wonderful. So he died and very comfortable, was not dehydrated, but the system, our system here, doesn't allow that to happen.
Yeah, it would be wonderful if we could create that. Yeah. The only other thing I want to say is, I think it was Joe's, one of his presentations that said, raise the questions, does the hospice, how are they going to ensure that you have appropriate nurses, appropriate care there? We're in a crisis. I'm sure all of you know that. Healthcare is still in a crisis post-COVID. There's not enough staff in the hospitals. There's definitely not enough staff in home care and in nursing homes. So how do we remedy that? Hopefully more people will go back into the field of healthcare for the appropriate reasons. But we're also in spiritual battle times. So we need to pray. Please pray for our healthcare providers, for all of those, us up here and everyone defending life at every stage. But also remember, we're in spiritual times, spiritual battles. And it's important for all of us to remember that and pray for these times.
Amen.
Let's just conclude with a glory be. Why don't we just conclude with a glory be? So glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.